All right, we're back. From John, we're reading Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. How does this help a person draw? It appears that the right brain processes visual information in a mode suitable for drawing, and that the left brain mode of functioning, L mode, may be inappropriate for the task. Because of the strength and dominance of the L mode, the problem we confront is how to set aside the L mode in order to access the R mode at the conscious level. Language cues reflect a long-held bias against the right brain. In hindsight, we realize that human beings, perhaps from the beginning, have had some sense of the differences between the halves of the brain and have shared the negative bias. Languages worldwide contain numerous words and phrases suggesting that the left side of a person's body, linked to and controlled by the right brain, has characteristics that are inferior to the right side of the body. Most of these phrases speak of hands, not of brain halves, but because the crossover connection of hands and hemispheres, the terms must be inferred to also mean the hemispheres that control the hands. Therefore, the examples of familiar terms for hands in the next section refer specifically to the left and right hands, but actually also refer inferentially to the opposite brain halves. The left hand controlled by the right hemisphere, the right hand controlled by the left brain. Parallel ways of knowing. And now here's a list of words. Intellect, intuition, convergent, divergent, digital, analogic, secondary, primary, abstract, concrete, directed, free, propositional, imaginative, analytic, relational, lineal, nonlineal, rational, intuitive, sequential, multiple, analytic, holistic, objective, subjective, successive, simultaneous. The duality of yin and yang. And first word's on the left, second word's on the right. Yin, yang, feminine, masculine, negative, positive, moon, sun, darkness, light, yielding, aggressive, left side, right side, cold, warm, autumn, spring, unconscious, conscious, right brain, left brain, emotion, reason. The bias of language and customs. Words and phrases referring to left and right hands indicate not just bodily location, but deep differences in fundamental traits or qualities as well. The right hand, inferring also to the left hemisphere, is strongly connected with what is good, just, moral, and proper. The left hand, therefore also the right hemisphere, is strongly linked with the concepts of anarchy and feeling that are out of verbal control and somehow bad, immoral, and dangerous. In religious literature, the devil is said to be left-handed, but in Ephesians 3:11, quote, Christ sits at the right hand of God. From ordinary life, a left-handed compliment, meaning a sly dig, refers to the pejorative qualities assigned to left hand, right brain. A right-handed compliment would be to call someone my right-hand man or woman, meaning my good, strong helper. Hand phrases can indicate conflict or disagreement between the two sides. For example, if we want to compare conflicting ideas, we say, usually with gestures. On one hand, ... but on the other hand, ... Until very recently, the ancient bias against the left-hand right hemisphere even led some parents and teachers of naturally left-handed children to force the children to use their right hands for writing, eating, and sometimes for sports, a practice that often caused problems lasting into adulthood, such as stammering, difficulty learning to read, and right-left directional confusion. Okay, and then we have some images from Aztecs in early Mexico used the left hand for medicine for kidney trouble, the right when curing the liver. In rare exception, the Incas of Peru considered left-handedness a sign of good fortune. And then Maya Indians favored the right side of the body. The twitching of a soothsayer left leg foretold disaster. There was no acceptable justification for teachers or parents to force a change. Reasons proffered run from writing with the left hand looks so uncomfortable to the world is set up for right-handers and my left-hand child would be at a disadvantage. These are not good reasons, and I believe they often mask an inherent prejudice against left-handedness, a prejudice rapidly disappearing. I'm happy to report perhaps the fact that 6 of our recent American presidents have been left-handed has helped ease prejudice. Truman, Ford, Reagan, who possibly was ambidextrous, which means he was right-handed and left-handed and could choose. Bush, Clinton, and Barack Obama. Worldwide cultural and historical terms of prejudice. Terms with connotations of good for the right hand, left hemisphere, and connotations of bad for the left hand, right hemisphere appear in the most languages around the world. The Latin word for left is sinister, meaning ominous or treacherous. The Latin word for right is dexter, from which comes our word dexterity, meaning skill, or adroitness. The French word for left remembered that the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere is gauche, meaning awkward, naive, or ill-mannered, from which comes our word gawky. Sorry, my alarm went off. The derogatory meaning of left may reflect a discomfort or suspicion directed by the right-handed majority against a minority of people who were different, that is, left-handed. In English, the word left comes from Anglo-Saxon left, meaning weak or worthless. The left hand of most right-handed people is, in fact, weaker than the right, but the original word also implies lack of moral strength. Reinforcing this bias, the Anglo-Saxon word for right, R-I-H-T, meant straight or just, from rect, and its Latin cognate, rectus, we derived our words correct and rectitude. These ideas are also reflected in our political vocabulary. The political right, for instance, admires national power and individual responsibility and resists change. The political left, conversely, admires people, power, and social responsibility and favors change. At their most extreme, the political right is fascist. The political left is anarchist. In the context of cultural customs, the place of honor at a formal dinner is on the host's right-hand side. The groom stands on the right in the marriage ceremony, the bride on the left. A nonverbal message of the relative status of the two participants. We shake hands with our right hands, and it seems somehow wrong to shake hands with our left hands. Under left-handed, The dictionary lists as synonyms clumsy, awkward, insecure, and malicious. Synonyms for right-handed, however, are correct: indispensable and reliable. Mind you, it's important to remember that when languages began, these contrasting terms were made up by early humans' left hemispheres, and the left brain gave itself all the best words. The right brain, labeled skewered and vilified by the left, was without a verbal language of its own to defend itself. Two ways of knowing. Along with the opposite connotations of left and right in our language, philosophers, teachers, and scientists from many different times and cultures have postulated concepts of the duality, or two-sidedness, of human nature and thought. The key idea is that there are two parallel ways of knowing. You are probably familiar with the following ideas embedded in our languages and culture. The main divisions are between thinking and feeling, intellect and intuition, and objective analysis and subjective insight. Political writers say that people generally analyze the good and bad points of an issue and then vote on their gut feeling. The history of science is replete with anecdotes about researchers who try repeatedly to figure out a problem and then have a dream in which the answer presents itself as a metaphor intuitively comprehended by the scientist. The statement regarding intuition by the 19th century mathematician Henri Poincaré is a vivid example of the process. In another context, people occasionally say about someone, quote, "The words sound okay, but something tells me not to trust him or her," end quote. Or, "I can't tell you in words exactly what it is, but there is something about that person that I like or dislike." These statements are intuitive observations indicating that both sides of the brain are at work simultaneously, processing the same information in two different ways. Inside each of our skulls, therefore, we have a double brain with two ways of knowing. The dualities and differing characteristics of the two halves of the brain and body, intuitively expressed in our language, have a real bias in the physiology of the human brain. But because the connecting fibers of the corpus callosum are intact in normal brains and can block passages of information, we are often not fully aware of contradictory responses occurring in the two halves. Two modes of information processing. As our hemispheres gather in the same sensory information, the task may be shared, each handling parts suited to its style, or one hemisphere, often the dominant left, can take over and inhibit the other half. Remember, language dominates. The left hemisphere verbalizes, analyzes, abstracts, counts, marks time, plans step-by-step procedures, makes rational statements based on logic, and looks to past experience to approach a new problem. Here is an example of an L-mode statement. Given numbers A, B, and C, we can say that if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is necessarily greater than C. This statement illustrates the mode. It is verbal, analytic, propositional, sequential, symbolic, linear, objective, and provably true. But we must remember, L mode can also spin an untrue story to explain why a problem situation. On the other hand, we have a second way of knowing, the right hemisphere mode. In this mode, we can see things in the mind's eye. In the example given just above, did you perhaps visualize the ABC relationship? If so, that would be an example of the hemispheres agreeing and cooperating in understanding the statement. In visual R mode, we see how things exist in space and how parts go together to make up a whole. Using the right hemisphere, we use metaphors and image solutions and create new combinations of ideas and novel ways to approach problems. Sometimes our visual mode may see things that the L mode can't or won't see, especially contradictory or ambiguous information. The right hemisphere tends to confront what is really out there, and there are times when language can be inadequate. When something is too complex to describe in words, we make gestures to communicate meaning. Psychologist David Gallen has a favorite example. Try to describe a spiral staircase without making a spiral gesture. This, then, is the right hemisphere mode, the intuitive, subjective, rational, holistic, time-free, reality-seeing mode. This is also the disdained, disparaged left-hand mode that in our culture has been generally ignored and virtually neglected by our educational system. Neurobiologist Jerry Levy, who contributed greatly to Roger Sperry's original work, said only half-jokingly at the time of Sperry's studies that she thought American education up through graduate school probably ablated the right hemisphere. Drawing and your creative potential. My students often report that learning to draw makes them feel more artistic and therefore more creative. One definition of a creative person is someone who can combine information directly at hand, the ordinary sensory data available to all of us in new, socially productive ways. A writer uses words, a musician notes, an artist visual perceptions, and all need some knowledge of the techniques of their crafts. I do believe that the arts in general are important for liberating your creative potential, and that learning to draw may be one of the more efficient ways. The aha response. In the creative mode, we use intuition and have leaps of insight, moments when everything seems to fall into place without figuring things out in a logical order. When this occurs, people often spontaneously exclaim, "I've got it," or "Ah, yes, now I see the picture." The classic example of the great aha is the exultant cry, "Eureka! I have found it," attributed to the Greek mathematician Archimedes. According to the story, Archimedes was asked by the king to determine whether a certain gold crown had been wrongly alloyed with silver. After long mulling over the difficult problem, Archimedes experienced a flash of insight while bathing. As he got into the tub, he noticed the water level rising. He suddenly saw that by submerging the crown in water and measuring the displaced water, he could determine the volume of the irregularly shaped crown and therefore the density of the metal, which would be less than that of pure gold if a cheaper and less dense metal had been added. The story concludes that Archimedes was so elated by this insight that, forgetting to get dressed, he ran naked into the street shouting, "Eureka! Eureka!" This story illustrates the importance of seeing connections between things that are seemingly unconnected in order to gain, in a telling word, insight. Handedness, left or right. Students often ask questions about left and right-handedness. This is a good place to briefly address the subject. Before we begin instruction in the basic skill of drawing, I clarify only a few points that relate to drawing because the extensive research on handedness is difficult and complicated. A useful way to regard handedness is to recognize that hand preference is the most visible outward sign of how an individual's brain is organized. There are other outward signs. Eyedness. Most of us have a dominant eye, the one held open when aiming at a target, and footedness, the foot used to step off a curb or to start a dance step. Hand preference is probably genetically determined, and forcing a change works against the natural brain organization. Natural hand preference for writing is so strong that past efforts to change left-handers often resulted in ambidexterity. Children capitulated to pressure. In the old days, even punishment, and learned to use the right hand for writing, but continued to use the left for everything else. Classifying people as strictly left-handed or right-handed is rarely accurate. People range from being completely left-handed or completely right-handed to being completely ambidextrous. That is, able to do many things with either hand without a decided preference. Most of us fall somewhere in a continuum, with about 90% of humans preferring more or less strongly the right hand and 10% preferring the left. The percentage of individuals with left-hand preference for handwriting seems to be rising from about 2% in 1932 to about 8 to 15% of the world population today. This change may reflect teachers' and parents' greater tolerance for left-handed writing. A summary description of L mode and R mode. L mode, verbal, using words to name, describe, define. Analytic, figuring things out step by step and part by part. Symbolic, using a symbol to stand for something. For example, the symbol I stands for I. The sign with the plus sign stands for the process of addition. Abstract, taking out a small bit of information and using it to represent a whole. Temporal, keeping track of time, sequencing one thing after another, doing first things first, second things second, etc. Literal, adhering to factual meaning of word or text, difficulty understanding metaphors. Rational, drawing conclusions based on reason and accepting facts. Digital, using numbers as in counting. Logical, drawing conclusions based on logic, one thing following another in step-by-step order, for example, a mathematical theorem or a well-stated argument. Linear, thinking in terms of linked ideas, one thought directly following the other, often leading to a convergent conclusion. The linear process can be brought to a halt by missing data. Now these are the R mode. Nonverbal, using visual, nonverbal cognition to process perceptions. Synthetic, putting parts together to form wholes, perceiving things in context. Actual, real, relating to things as they are in reality at the present moment. Analogic, seeing likeliness among things, understanding metaphoric relationships. Non-temporal, lacking a sense of time passing. Imaginative, conjuring mental visual images, real or imagined. Non-rational, not requiring a basis of reason or facts. Willingness to suspend judgment. Spatial, seeing where things are located in space in relation to other things and how parts go together to form a whole. Intuitive, making leaps of insight, often based on incomplete patterns, hunches, feelings, visual images, or visual connections, able to jump across missing data. Holistic, seeing whole things all at once in reality and in all of their complexity, perceiving overall patterns and structures, often leading to divergent conclusions. All right. And I'll take a little break so I can get some water. Differences between left-handers and right-handers. Putting prejudice aside, there are differences between left-handers and right-handers. Specifically, language is meditated in the left hemisphere in about 90% of right-handers. Of the remaining 10% of right-handers, about 2% have language located in the right brain, and about 8% meditate language in both hemispheres. Left-handers can be somewhat less lateralized than right-handers, meaning that functions are less clearly located in one or the other half of the brain. For example, left-handers more frequently than right-handers process language and spatial information in both hemispheres. Some left-handers have language located in the left brain, and these individuals often write in the hooked position that seems to cause teachers so much dismay. Surprisingly, right-handers with right hemisphere language location, which is fairly rare, may also write in hooked fashion. Do these differences matter? Individuals vary so much that generalizations are risky. Nevertheless, some experts agree in general that a mixture of functions in both hemispheres, that is, mixed dominance, or a lesser degree of lateralization, creates the potential for conflict or interference. It is true that left-handers statistically are more susceptible to stammering and to experiencing certain ways of thinking, such as tending to see both sides of every question in making decisions. However, other experts suggest that bilateral distribution of functions may produce superior mental abilities, perhaps because of easier access to both modes. Left-handers seem to excel in mathematics, music, sports, and chess. And the history of art certainly suggests evidence of an advantage for left-handedness in the field of art. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael were all left-handed. Handedness in drawing. Does left-handedness then improve a person's ability to gain access to right hemisphere functions such as drawing? From my observations as a teacher, I can say that I have noticed much differences in the ease of learning to draw between left and right-handers. As a child, drawing came easily for me, for example, and I am extremely right-handed, though, like many people, especially women, I have some right-left confusion, perhaps indicating some mixed dominance. But there is a point to be made here. The process of learning to draw can create some degree of mental conflict between the two modes. It's possible that left-handers are more used to that kind of conflict and are therefore better able to cope with the discomfort it creates than are fully lateralized right-handers. Clearly, much more research is needed in this area. Some art teachers recommend that right-handers shift the pencil to the left hand, presumably to have more direct access to the R mode. I do not agree. The problem with seeing that prevents individuals from being able to draw do not disappear simply by changing hands. The drawing is just more awkward. Awkwardness, I regret to say, is viewed by some art teachers as being more creative and more interesting. I think this attitude does a disservice to the student and is demeaning to art itself. We do not view awkward language, for instance, or awkward science as being more creative and somehow better. By trying to draw with their left hand, a small percentage of right-handed students do discover that they actually draw more proficiently that way. On questioning, however, it almost always comes to light that the student has some ambidexterity, or was a left-hander who had been pressured to change. It would not occur to a true right-hander like myself or to a true left-hander to draw with the less used hand. But on the chance that a few of you may discover some previously hidden ambidexterity, I encourage you to try both hands at drawing, then settle on whichever hand feels the most comfortable. In the chapters to follow, I address the instructions to the majority right-handers and thus avoid a tedious repetition of instructions specifically for left-handers. Trust me, this indicates no prejudicial handism. Okay, on my part, prejudice that left-handers know all too well, setting up the conditions for the L to R shift. The exercises in the next chapter are designed to cause a hypothesized mental shift from L mode to the R mode, the brain mode appropriate for drawing. The basic assumption of the exercise is that the nature of the task can influence which hemisphere will take up the job while inhibiting the other hemisphere. But the question arises, what factors determine which mode will predominate? Through studies with animals, split-brain patients, and individuals with intact brains, scientists believe that the control question may be decided mainly in two ways. One is speed. Which hemisphere gets the job the quickest? A second way is motivation. Which hemisphere cares most or likes the task the best? And conversely, which hemisphere cares least and likes the job the least? And I think that's a good place to stop for today. And then we will be back next episode. So thanks for bearing with me. And we'll be back. See you next time.